think I'll start with the question that brought me to this thesis. It's a bit of a conundrum. Imagine a country the size of New Jersey, with the capability of Silicon Valley, with an internal refugee problem. This is the problem that brought me to this. And before I go into the essential core question of my topic, I think I'm going to go into the background a little bit. So I'm dealing with an issue in Israel. And for those who don't know about this, in 2005, the Israeli government had a unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip. In the Gaza Strip, there were close to 9,000 people living as settlers. These are Israeli citizens who were living in this territory. In 2005, they were removed from their homes and resettled throughout the nation. So here on the right, you see the dots represent the different areas throughout the country that they've been resettled. But were they really resettled? 2/3 of the people still live in caravans. I think the number for the unemployment, I've seen different numbers, but it's between 15 to 19% unemployment. A lot of these people are living on government welfare. It's been 7 years, and they're still living in temporary housing, which was actually only built to last 3 years. Within the next year, the resettlement agency that was specifically created to deal with the resettlement of these people will be closing, without a lot of these people being rehoused. What I'm going to be looking at is the mechanism that was used to rehouse them, the failures within that. Another part of this is that a lot of these people actually now have to start paying rent for these caravillas that they're living in that are run down, not working. Within the process, the people were, the main planning mechanism that was used was compensation packages, individual compensation packages, in order to help these families build new homes on their own. A lot of families have actually used that money already for day-to-day living expenses. So a lot of them don't actually have the money to move to permanent settlements. So what I'm looking at here is an understanding of what the failure is. There's been a lot of work actually already written about the government failure. There was a national inquiry that was published in 2010 going extensively into the different aspects of failure on the part of the government in dealing with these people. But it's a complex issue, and there are two sides to it. A lot of the refugees who were living there due to religious purposes, and a lot of them didn't want to move. There was a lot of trauma, there was a lot of emotion involved, and the people did not want to work with the government towards a sustainable solution. So the plan prior to evacuating the settlers basically was non-existent, except for this idea of compensation packages. So there was no physical plan of how the government would deal with this. So while the failure of the mechanism has been identified, my interest really is looking at whether it was the design or implementation of the mechanism, or whether it was underlying causes on both the sides of the settlers and the government that actually undermined the effectiveness of this mechanism. And what my point is to look at what are these underlying root causes that are tied to the emotional and politically sensitive nature of the evacuation, and what type of mechanism can be created to overcome these internal issues. This becomes very relevant in a lot of future situations and a lot of resettlement situations across the world where there are emotional ties and emotional considerations that are not necessarily just planning considerations, that before you actually put any plan in place must be understood in order to come up with a comprehensive solution and a way for the people to be able to actually work with the government successfully, as opposed to ignoring that and saying that the people don't want to work with them. I think it's important to also say what I'm not doing here. I'm not talking about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. I'm not talking about whether settlements should exist within the West Bank as they do right now. I'm not touching on that. Those are relevant issues, and the political background behind the unilateral disengagement is also important, but that's not what I'm touching on here. What I'm really focusing on is just the internal Israeli government processes, and understanding, is it the institutional failure that intrinsically exists in the Israeli system, or whether it's something else. So in identifying this failure, there's been a lot of work already done talking about the compensation packages, talking about the way the handling of them, the issues within the body, but there hasn't, the question of what the failure was has been answered, but not necessarily the why. And in order to move forward with actually dealing with not only the current issue and figuring out how to rehouse the remaining people, but also moving into the future. And this is where it kind of overlaps with the peace process in that it could undermine the removal of settlements from the West Bank, in that a lot of the people, when that starts coming up, will point to this as a dramatic failure. If there is evacuation from the West Bank, there will be close to 100,000 settlers that need to be rehoused within the nation, and they can't even deal with 9,000. So just, I think the importance of an expedient resettlement here is important, but in order to deal with that, there needs to be an understanding of also the psychology behind it, the identity of the settlers, and understanding whether there's a common ground for the government to work with the settlers in this type of situation. And once that common ground can be reached, then I think steps forward can be suggested. And this is a bit of my approach to this. I'm starting with a historical understanding of just what happened here. It's really complex, there are a lot of moving pieces, and it's been a bit difficult to actually come up with what happened. Who's responsible for what? You know, the NGOs, the government, the private sector, the settlers, who was responsible for what part of this? So a bit of sparsing that out. Looking at comparisons, what also struck me is that Israel in the 90s actually was able to absorb 400,000 immigrants from the Soviet Union, and did it relatively successfully. There were some issues, but why didn't they learn from those lessons? Especially just the physical planning aspect. It's understandable that there are differences in the emotional aspect, but that's why I'm interested in comparing what were the differences in the circumstances. What was succeeded in one situation that couldn't be applied here. Looking at the literature of the settler identity, which actually is very important here, and with how can the government actually leverage the settler identity and actually use it in order to work with the settlers towards some sort of sustainable future. And I'm planning to go in January to Israel to speak with settlers, both that have been rehoused into permanent settlements, into permanent housing, and those who are actually still living in the caravillas. I hope to speak to people in different situations and from different backgrounds. So I think a lot of the people who found permanent housing, I think about 200 families actually left on their own before the disengagement process. They were given pretty large compensation packages, and they left on their own. A lot of those were not religiously motivated. So there are differences in the basis of who these people are and their identities and why they're in the situations they are, but I'm interested in speaking to them and understanding what they see as future steps. Because there's an understanding of, you know, they're just religious settlers, they don't want to talk to us, the government's just sort of raise their hands and saying that they want to deal with it. So my interest is there some common ground here that can be a basis for future negotiations? And I hope to plan to also speak to government officials, trying to figure out who will speak with me, because I think this is a very sensitive issue. And I think if I approach it in the respect of trying to create lessons learned and recommendations for future and current issues within this, but looking at it as a more positive, as opposed to accusatory. That might be a way to go about this, but it's a sensitive issue, so I'm sort of just going to see what I end up with after speaking with different people and hope for the best. So thank you, and I'm happy to take your comments.
This is, I have to disclose I'm from Israel, so this is very close to my heart, and it's very much, I really appreciate this work. I think it's so relevant and important, and I think you've underestimated the amount of work that's being done to analyze this thing is really on the political arena, the political process, and the stakeholders and how they've managed amongst themselves. But really the failure here, I think, stems from the fact that it was treated as a political/security problem, but not as a planning challenge, and versus the absorption of the Russian aggression, which is a huge, or housing in Israel in the 50s when hundreds and thousands, millions of people came as refugees. Israel managed that, but this is sort of a political issue, so planning is not a player. And I think it's so crucial to understand the failures, and I think the mapping of finding the gaps in between the players is just a key, because it's not only key for us to learn from that, but it is so true that people look at the future and say, we didn't even manage to evacuate these 7,000 people. How will we deal with 100,000, with 200,000? No chance. Look at them, they're crazy. That's the common knowledge that people have now, and it's so important to show this is possible and how. So I would say, amazing question. So focus on the gaps and really. I'd love for it to mature into recommendations for how to build a healthier process like you're intending for the future. That would be so valuable for to the community.
I think it was an excellent, it was like 6 weeks in. That's an incredibly precise set of questions for where you're at, and I'm super impressed with how you verbally convey that, but also kind of the considerations, the questions you're asking. You never mentioned that there's a term, the name of there's 2 words that I didn't, it said ish.
Oh, Gush Katif?
Gush Katif, I don't know what that is.
That's what the settlements are called.
Okay.
The area is called.
So
it's just where they come out of.
Okay, so that would have been helpful, because I thought for a while that was a single place. So, but I just thought it was incredibly engaging, the way that you laid out the series of questions, and I just completely, not having very much background in it, I felt completely informed, and I was completely convinced that Mike's four questions here were being served. The one thing that I think will be really important, because you're saying that you're trying to emphasize the kind of the relationship between emotional and political forces at play here, that the narratives, the methodology, I think is going to be really critical for you. So you do this kind of background literature review, you talk to lots of people, but then how do you actually collate those positions, which have to be, on the one hand, kind of representative, but also you're talking about various kind of positions, various, subjectivities. And so I would give a lot of time for your thesis. I think that's going to be a really powerful part of it, in terms of whether it's video or photo documentation or written statements or something like that. But I think that will be as important as the kind of more quantitative analysis that you're doing.
Yeah, I think I had similar thoughts regarding methodology as well. This being very central to how you're going to go forward. And so far it seems, I think your framework is very good, and it seems like you've obviously thought through a lot how you're going to approach not just the subject, but I think from here on in, actually thinking about how you're going to approach these people that you're actually going to talk to. I appreciate your desire to not take a political stance on the issue. But then I think a lot of thought has to go into how are you going to treat such a highly politicized subject without getting entangled in the politics of it, particularly when it comes down to representing the ideas or the thoughts or the policies of the settlers, the NGOs, and the government officials. I think that it's like a lot of care and thought needs to go into how that's going to be translated. And I think part of that means that on your own interior, you may very well have a stance, right? But then you need to reconcile that with the information that you're getting in so that you can present it in a way that best serves the overall goal of the thesis. So I would just encourage to really, I mean, I don't know exactly what kind of literature this is, but maybe that's something else that goes into the literature review, to be honest. Understanding different ways that other people may get engaged in a similar kind of project and dealt with these sort of really highly politicized issues. How are they able to represent the positions of the different people involved in a way that best serves the project and not necessarily the goals of those individuals or of the state?
Thank you.
So, at the sort of extreme level, I personally question the use of the word settlers. And the reason I do is not because it hasn't been used, but it immediately distinguishes the character of these people versus others who are, quote, resettled. I mean, in resettlement worldwide, we don't necessarily refer to the people who are being resettled as settlers who are now being resettled. They're being resettled, but they just happen to be individuals who are somewhere. And yet, settlers, and that's why that word is used, has a very sort of specific political, finally, meaning, which ties back in at a more fundamental level to the emotion attached to it. So I think that's a very key, I suspect, part of this. I mean, you didn't sort of, you implied what you think is sort of, at base, some of the problems here. I suspect that a lot of the problems here are a result of who these people were to begin with, a very self-selected group of people who decided to settle in an area of contested land, and as a result are a specific kind of person. It's like in a totally different context. I remember many, many years ago I did a study of Columbia, Maryland, and right when it started, which dates me a little bit, and I lived there for a week and did a little bit of a sort of case study, ethnographic analysis, living with a family. And all the people who moved to Columbia initially, Columbia, Maryland, this new town, they wanted to be in this experiment. They self-selected and they viewed themselves as pioneers, etc. So if you suddenly, dispersed them or resettled them, they're different than, people who have just lived in a village for 5,000 years and are suddenly, because of some, military conflict or, country change, or suddenly kicked out or whatever. So that's going to be, I think, a central part of this, and it's quite interesting and it's very, very specific. And you may even want to, again, to repeat, look at the word settler. And why are we even using that word settler to describe, other than that that's what's used? I mean, is that a neutral term? Is that a good term, a bad term, etc.? I'm not trying to politicize this, but again, as we all recognize, it is political. But I think it's much more than that. This is a very self-selected group. And so when you do your other case studies of resettlement, I mean, what you really hopefully want to find is other case studies of resettlement where the people who are being resettled settled someplace initially in order to sort of, because of what they were trying to do, which is to populate an area, to make facts on the ground, to et cetera. So they're much harder to resettle because they actually, I mean, they may not be harder to resettle, by the way. Maybe somebody's been someplace for 1,000 years, families that, they're hard to resettle too. Suzette Kilo, was sort of hard to resettle also, or Wilhelmina Dairy. So there are lots, I think that's really interesting. Now on methodology, I don't think you're going to have time to do it, but boy, wouldn't it be great if you could do a survey. I mean, this begs for a survey of these people. In other words, beyond, 5 interviews.
Yeah.
It just may be impossible. It's January. It's also, are they even going to accept your, how would you even do it? But that would be great. It may have already been done. I don't know. These people may have already been surveyed. But I'd love to get a broader than just, some interviews. But,
Yeah.
you do the best you can. Is that possible? Or?
I'm not sure if it's possible, but like the commission inquiry was based on surveys and interviews with like 400 of the settlers,
good.
and it did include NGOs. So there is a voice there, and there is some background there. And so I think when I visit, I'll see whether it's possible or not. And I think it's going to really depend on like my network.
Well, if it's already been
connections
done,
there.
then
Yeah.
there's no need for you to do
But
it.
not necessarily the questions that I'd like to ask.
Well, that's
is
what
the-
that means.
Yeah, so it's spoken to them, I think, about like the failure and how like the state failed them and their relationship in this process, but
I would, tomorrow, prepare a rough draft of a survey that you would have administered.
yeah, I'm working on.
Good, I think that's terrific. And then that can inform, obviously, your interviews.
Mhm.
But that's a crucial kind of document
Mhm.
that can organize what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think your point of saying that like this is a self-selected group is really important, because I think that's the key here of what I'm trying to see if there's a mechanism that can overcome that.
Right.
That like can treat these people that are very clearly a specific case,
Yes.
but can they be treated just like any other case? Like, or
Well,
what?
Hannah, there are
Yeah.
there's the before and the after, and I'll now get to the after, but the before always is, who are the people? I mean, think of everybody who is resettled, okay? There are people who have lived in a place for a long time. There's Suzette Kilo. There are people who have lived in public housing, who through the Hope 6 program in the United States were resettled, or people who have been in any sort of situation where we're building a highway or building anywhere around the world who are resettled, or people who are resettled because of climate change now, and they're going to be, or floods, who have to be, people in Japan who were resettled. I mean, this is a worldwide phenomenon, hugely important and interesting, and that's looking at the before condition. What are the characteristics? What are the differences among those sorts of people? This is a kind of specific subset of that. Then there's the after, and at an oversimplified level spatially, we talk about things like concentration versus dispersal. I mean, imagine moving these people from one concentrated place to another concentrated place versus just giving them money and allowing them to disperse throughout where they're going to afterwards. And there are examples, comparisons, precedents all around, whether it's in the Moving to Opportunity program in the United States, Section 8.2, other kinds of programs where people have been given money to resettle, which is one of the climate change strategies now. So it's a big phenomenon that you're working in, and your literature review will be important, although you can't do everything. But you'll want to get that full literature review, but then focus in particular, of course, on as well case studies of sort of settlers, people who were moved in and then were moved out for obvious reasons here, or reasons we're aware of.
I wonder, just to reiterate Jenna's point about the politics, because I think it's true having a slide of what this will not address is like indicating that you're interested in stating clearly that you're not interested in like future resettlement issues. But I wonder if the question of like the settler, which I think is totally a political term, maybe if you can kind of unpack that a little bit in terms of what the politics means in the future. I mean, I don't know how you would do that without falling on one side or the other, but just calling attention to the politicized nature of any group of people and the fact that they're called settlers, I think could be really valuable.
I mean, I literally mean, question the word settler. I mean, that's my.
I think that's so important, and I think that will help address Jenna's issue of falling on one side or the other, or not.
I would take out that. I didn't buy your slide at all on the political, by the way. That you're not addressing.
Yes.
Well, it's not that I'm not addressing the political. I'm not addressing the question of whether settlements from the West Bank should be removed. Whether it should be a two-state or one-state
I understand that, but
solution.
in a way, I would, for the moment, remove that. Don't worry about it. What you're doing is, by the way, everything we do in scholarship, planning, it's always political. This happens to be a little more political. So, for the moment, don't erase the slide. For the moment, I'm sort of conceptually saying, for the moment, don't worry about that. Just do your work and then figure out finally, you know, the implications of finally what you come up with. I don't think you need to, in short, in advance, unburden yourself of that. I think that's a false unburdening. Anyway, I understand why you're saying it, but I don't think you need to say it to yourself right now. Just do your work.
The reason that I included it was because every time I would bring up this topic, people, instead of understanding that it was resettlement within Israel, because it's an internal process as opposed to the Palestinian-Israeli process, which is a different question. So I'm not depoliticizing it. I'm just.
I know, but all you have to say is factually, I'm looking at Gaza settlers who are, you know, were resettled into Israel. I mean, that's the factual case that you're looking at, which is fine. I mean, that, you know, no one's going to think, oh, do you mean Palestinians, or do you mean West Bank settlers, or you present your case. I mean, when you say I'm not doing it, that always makes somebody think, well, actually you are.
Well, I think I know where Hannah's coming from doing that. I think it's important to draw, maybe it should be on the positive one, to draw the boundaries. This is what I'm looking at, with implications to the future, but that's my focus. It's like a minefield in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's very true how the people respond to it like that. And another thing is the word settlers just came to my mind as we were discussing. In Hebrew, there are two words that would translate into settlers. So the settlers would use one word, and the other people would use another. So they're like.
And what is that? What is the difference in Hebrew between the two words?
So one is just coming and sitting in a place, whereas settlers, as we refer to it in English, is infiltrating a place. So they shouldn't have, it's a question whether they should be there or not, whereas if you just come and set up a place, it's more legitimate. So if they use that word.
But just out of curiosity, in Hebrew, if somebody moves to land in Israel, Israel proper, you know, somewhere, and builds a house, does somebody use the word settler for them?
No. So not like it's politicized now. You'd use the other one.
So settler does refer to somebody in Gaza or the West Bank.
Yeah. So there are two words, and I think it's even if you use it, you introduce the term in Hebrew in the beginning, and you just use it throughout, and or use it to instances to just differentiate, because it's true. It's just something I wouldn't mention to here, but it's just there is a difference.
Yeah.
Thank you.